This. Well, this is the class REL 340, the Gospel of John. Because of certain circumstances beyond my control, we are going to be having short lectures for the first few weeks to talk about some of the ideas, and then we will gather for questions later in the week. So today we will be covering the introductory matters, some of the key issues that we need to know about the Gospel of John from a historical standpoint, and also from the literary standpoint of comparing it with the other biblical books, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, which are the synoptics. There's a tremendous amount of discussion. Currently, not as much as in the early part of the last century, even up through the 1980s, that noted that the Gospel of John used as a information source the written Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, most likely using Mark, may have had Luke and John as well. That then became a little bit more questioned in the 1950s and 60s by certain writers who proposed that perhaps John did not use those sources. And some said, well, they may not have used Matthew and Luke, but probably utilized Mark, and John is rewriting Mark in order to tell the story and get the information that he needs. Then other questions came about, and scholars started to feel that John had not used the literary sources, but instead had at his availability and was familiar with the oral traditions, the stories that were told before things were written down. And that's why the material in John is so different while still being Jesus-like in comparison with the Synoptic Gospels. And so one of the major questions that always gets asked is whether or not John utilized the synoptics. And this is a matter for what we call source criticism, trying to find the sources of the material. The second way in which John is often approached is historical. Now, back in the late 1700s, one British writer proposed that the only actual gospel we can take for any kind of factual information is the Gospel of Luke. Others jumped on board and said that we have Matthew and Mark as well, but John lagged behind in the scholarly opinion. And so one of the issues that is raised is that, well, Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell the same stories, so they must be the stories. But John doesn't tell those stories, so there's no other evidence for that. Plus, in the 1700s, the 1800s, and even the early 1900s, some of the things that John talks about were not actually discovered by archaeologists working in the area, which caused them to draw other conclusions about John. One of the famous conclusions is that John is a mystical document, that it is a received revelation, much like the book of Revelation, that John has this visionary approach. Now, part of this is due to the historical account dating back to the 2nd century, where Clement of Alexandria describes the Gospel of John as a spiritual gospel in comparison with the others. But what does that actually mean? The word he uses is really fleshly for the other gospels. So it's not the one spiritual and flesh, but he's drawing a different comparison of the two. And so to take those words out of the context leads us in a very bad position. But there were a couple of people in the early 1900s, including some in the Christian spiritual formation. Evelyn Underhill is one of those that name you may be familiar with, who said it's a mystical document and has this mystical viewpoint. That perspective is not as relevant, and we can talk about why if there are some questions about that. And so the other question was that John is whether it's historical or not. And as we mentioned, a lot of times things were not found, but in the late 1900s, starting about 1960, archaeology began to understand and identify some things that John actually does describe in with more accuracy than people thought. So opinions had to be reformed, which is part of the study of the Bible. Sometimes we come across evidence and we have to reform our opinion of what's going on. And we'll talk about this quite important, but when he heals the man in John chapter 5 at the five pools called Bethesda, they had no historical records of those pools until they were refound underneath some other buildings in Jerusalem. And so one is that John is historically accurate, but some wonder if he could be historically accurate since it's written so much farther in. And so it's often a question from a historical standpoint. Third area that we always need to talk about is who is actually writing this gospel. Officially, the gospel is anonymous. Whoever wrote this gospel, as well as Matthew, Mark, Luke, did not include his name within the text. And as far as the text that we currently have, which dates for quite some time. So traditionally, it has been ascribed to someone named John, and there are various Johns who could be this one ascribed to. One is John the Apostle, the brother of James, who James was then martyred early in the Christian history. In the book of Acts talks about his death. And so there is John the Apostle, who is one of those. There are references to John the Elder. The Johannine letters, 2 and 3, have the author named themselves as the elder. And there are some second century individuals who talk about John the Elder and John the Apostle as though they're different individuals. The book of Revelation has John on Patmos, the island of Patmos. And so sometimes the John the Patmos is distinguished from John the Apostle. And then there is a position that there were a group of people who were surrounding the Apostle John. And so this was then written by what they would call school in a philosophical sense, the Johannine school. Or some people say Johannine. It depends on where you want to place the syllable or the emphasis of the syllable, Johannine or Johannine at the beginning or earlier, and was written by that. And whether the school exists or not is still a matter of debate, even though Alan Culpepper argues for that John seems to show some tendencies of other philosophical schools. The fourth thing we like to talk about is provenance. Provenance simply means where is the writing originating from. The most standard position is Ephesus. And so in the background of this video, you've been looking at a street in the city of Ephesus on the western bank of modern-day Turkey, and which was the province of Asia. And there are several traditional locations of John, the author of the gospel, being in Ephesus. Some individuals have placed it as being written from Alexandria, and others think it may have been written in Palestine. And the fact of the matter is, from a factual standpoint, we simply cannot know. We have to take the information from the traditional sense and say it is traditional information. But under a 21st century logic, it doesn't hold up as facts. In the first, second, third century, even through the 16th and 17th centuries, it held up as pretty much the accurate, and that's why the um, the weight of history stands with John the author writing from Ephesus. So finally, what we want to talk about in this very short introduction are some of the issues we have to deal with when we are interpreting the Gospel of John. One, we have to look at the historical relevance of the words of Jesus and the concept of biblical inspiration. Now, we'll talk about these as we go through, but are these the words of Jesus? How were the words of a teacher received and recognized in the ancient world? And what is our 21st century perspective of how those words should have been received? And so the historical relevance of the words of Jesus is one thing that we will have to deal with and discuss. The second is the theological relevance of the words of Jesus and biblical interpretation. So, how do we understand the words of Jesus as revealing who God is? Third, the historical relevance of the actions of Jesus described within. There is an entire model of scholarship that denies any kind of miraculous because it can't be confirmed or uh, reduplicated, which are part of the standards of modern history. But if we look at it from an ancient perspective, there were many who were considered to be miracle workers. And so, are these historically relevant, the actions of Jesus? And we might want to look at the theological relevance of the actions of Jesus. Are they revealing something about who God is and what God is about in the book? And so then we have to look at how do we read through this gospel and interpret the text with historical relevance in mind. And how do we look through the gospel, read the text, and interpret the text with a view of theological relevance? So, as we are looking at discussing the Gospel of John, the basic summary of those 6 points I just mentioned is, where do we find meaning in the gospel? The question most people ask, what does the gospel mean? Well, is it the meaning theological? Is it historical? Can it be both at the same time? Probably not. But when we are looking for meaning, are we looking for historical meaning or theological meaning, or just trying to make sense of some of the things that are said? And in the gospel, Jesus speaks a great deal. And so the words of Jesus are very important to figure out. And so these are some of the topics that we will explore briefly. And you will find in any commentary someone expressing an opinion about some of these issues, because those are the questions that we ask when we're studying the Gospels. So that's going to be all for this particular video, and we want to catch up with the second one.